This is a very convincing win. The less contention there can be about these results, the better. Whatever you think of particular American policies and whatever you think of particular American presidents, a strong and effective America is good for the wider world and it's good for Australia.
Australia is the greatest nation on earth. And at the referendum last year, Australians told the elites they want to keep it that way. Is 2024 the year mainstream Australians continue to secure our way of life, or will the elites strike back? In Season 3 of Australia's Future, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott will share his unique insight on the future of the Australian way of life. Hello Tony, and g'day to all of our listeners. Great to be back. Today, Tony will be sharing his insights into the US election, what it means for Australia, what it means for America, and what it means for the world. Tony, great to be back.
Dan, lovely to be with you.
Well, it was a big win for Trump. Not quite a landslide, but comprehensive and undeniable. Pretty widespread across the country, and I think at the upper end of what most people were expecting was possible. He won all of the swing states. And we had the results on the night of the election, which many of us didn't expect. So just to start with your assessment of the election itself and the outcomes for Trump and for the US.
Well, Dan, you're right. It was a very strong win. It wasn't a landslide, but it was completely unambiguous. He had a strong majority in the Electoral College. He had, I think, roughly 52 to 48% of the popular vote. It looks like the Republicans have definitely got the Senate and most likely retain control of the House. So this is a very convincing win. And I suppose a sign of just how strong it is was the fact that the Democrats have been telling their supporters to accept the result. None of the contention that we got in 2016 where Hillary Clinton and her people were basically saying they were robbed. So that's good because the less contention there can be about these results, the better. And whatever you think of particular American policies and whatever you think of particular American presidents, a strong and effective America is good for the wider world and it's good for Australia, as well as obviously being good for Americans. I should say this though, Dan. There's a lot of commentary at the moment that this is a absolutely seismic event and global politics has, as it were, changed overnight. I don't think we should underestimate the significance of this, but it is possible to overestimate the significance of this as well. Remember, the iron law of politics is oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. And the result in America last week is less people loving Donald Trump and everything he stands for, and more people being very unhappy at the state of their country and rejecting the wokery, the economic mismanagement, and the general decay that they see in American society right now. Now, if Trump does well in this second term, particularly if he does markedly better in a second term than he did in the first, well, all of the causes and positions that he supports will be strengthened. If, on the other hand, it's not a particularly effective administration, well, his positions and his causes will be discredited. So this idea that suddenly the world has gone from soft left to hard right is incorrect. That said, there are lots of lessons and lots of ramifications for us here in Australia and for the wider world, as well as for America itself.
Are some of those lessons in terms of the realignment? So we saw Trump comprehensively win blue-collar working class voters in a similar way as he did in 2016. He also had swings towards him with young people. He won in the high 40s among young people, which is unheard of for a Republican in the modern day, and also swings to him among African Americans and Hispanics and the broader migrant community. So there's a lot of very positive trends there, and it would suggest that he had a very mainstream appeal across American society, not just the grievance of lower income white Americans, as some would suggest. Would that be one of the lessons for Australia?
I think that's right, Dan, and I would desperately like to hope that his sweeping success is a sign that we might finally have passed peak woke. That's what I would like to think. But I don't think that can be taken for granted because a lot rides now on whether his administration succeeds or fails, and we just can't be confident at this stage how things will pan out. And there are lots of external factors as well that could suddenly cause all sorts of complications. But certainly it was a sign that the identity politics that the Democrats are increasingly playing to is not currently working. Yes, Trump did far better amongst black voters, he did far better amongst unionists, he did far better amongst Latinos and other minorities than was expected. And I suppose part of that is the bigger a minority gets, the more diverse it becomes, and Latinos, if I might use that phrase, quite apart from the fact that people from different parts of South America are very different. They're not all homogenous, as it were. But the people from South America or Latin America who are now in the United States, many of them have now been there for a couple of generations. They're not all agricultural labourers. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're entrepreneurs, and so their interests change over time. But certainly the fact that Trump, at his best, tried to appeal to Americans as a whole and tried to appeal to the instinctive pride that most people have in America, I think is a very positive sign. And look, if you're any kind of a migrant, you normally have a great deal of affection and regard for the place you've come to, because let's face it, you chose it. I mean, why would anyone who didn't like America choose to go to America? And normally, if my parents chose America because they thought that it was a land of opportunity, and they did well, as most of them do, because they work hard and they are normally given a fair go, why wouldn't I, as their son or grandson, like America as well, and be proud of the success that my family's had? And this is true of black people as well. I mean, again, this idea that every black American is somehow the victim of racism and exploitation, if it was ever true, it's much less true today than it was in the past. So these are all very encouraging developments, but again, administrations are judged on their performance, and this result was fundamentally a judgment against the Biden-Harris administration, at least as much as it was a judgment for Donald Trump. And yes, people looked back in response to his question, are you better off now than 4 years ago? Resoundingly, the answer was no. So they looked back to his administration when wages increased, employment increased, the stock market boomed, energy prices fell, and America's economic dynamism grew. They looked back at that and said, well, actually, yeah, Trump was a much better president, and that was why I think all the talk of Trump being a fascist and a Nazi and all the rest of it didn't cut much mustard in the end. But, as I said, now it's all there for him to do his best, and let's hope he does, because, as I say, if he succeeds, everything that is associated with him will tend to flourish. If he fails, all the causes that he is associated with, the anti-wokery, the anti-political correctness, the patriotism, the realism on climate and energy, that will tend to be discredited as well.
And so for Australia, what do you think this means for us? There's the domestic policy component, obviously. Yeah. There's renewed agitation around net zero, and Trump wants to get out of Paris, and he will. Paris Climate Agreement, that is. There's the issue pertaining to tariffs, how that might affect us, and then also the actual international alliance and AUKUS, among other matters. What's your assessment of how Australia will be affected by this victory?
I don't think anyone should fear this victory, although obviously with a new and quite different administration, we will have to accept that America's priorities have, in some substantial respects, changed. And obviously, the current government here, with its emissions obsession, no longer has a like-minded partner in Washington, and I think that's very significant, given the importance of energy in terms of cost of living and in terms of general economic competitiveness. So that's going to change. I think that the Trump administration will be a lot more expectant that we will do more in our own defence. The fact that we talk a big game but almost never deliver on it will be noticed by Trump in a way that it perhaps was not so noticed by the Biden-Harris administration. I think we will be expected to spend more on our military. Things like doing a deal with an American space company to produce satellites for the Australian Armed Forces, a $7 billion deal which then gets cancelled after 18 months. That kind of thing will be noticed in Washington much more under Trump than perhaps under Biden. The relationship will remain strong because we have been, along with Britain, America's closest ally for the last 50 or 60 years. But I do think that the assumption that is routine from Prime Minister Albanese and Energy Minister Bowen that the world is moving inexorably towards this so-called green transition is going to be even more threadbare than it was before. You've now got the world's three biggest emitters, China, the United States and India, much more concerned with their economic well-being than they are with the state of their emissions, which is going to make Australia's insistence on cutting emissions at almost any cost, at almost any price, look even more anomalous.
Interested in your take on comments by JD Vance, Vice President-elect, who said to the effect that with regards to European nations that they should be supporting free speech, otherwise support from the US might be questioned from a defence perspective. And clearly here in Australia with the misinformation laws, I'm not sure if he's aware of those, but presumably that could be weighing on the mind of the administration. So you've always got to be careful because we don't want our sovereignty to be impeded, whether it's in the name of good or bad. But it also does drive home to me that just how influential the US can be in the domestic politics of other nations. And if they are going to be forward-leaning and anti-wokery and supporting free speech as perhaps a partial condition of US defence and national security support, that could potentially be a positive for our nation, I think.
Well, yeah, there's no doubt that Trump's win has been a huge morale booster for centre-right conservative politics everywhere, even though Trump is an unusual conservative because he is so resolutely anti-woke, he is so resolutely politically incorrect. It has been a huge shot in the arm psychologically. How much it's going to translate into our own domestic politics is yet to be seen. The presence of Elon Musk as a big Trump backer and possibly as a part of the new administration is obviously going to be a huge boost for free speech. And as we've talked about before, Dan, I think there are huge dangers in things like this misinformation and disinformation bill. The idea that bureaucrats in Canberra will be sitting in judgment on what is and is not permitted speech is appalling. It's absolutely appalling. I mean, we've seen already, as Mark Zuckerberg has admitted, online censorship from big tech, and that will just get far worse under this Miss-Dis bill. So I think that the influence of the change of administration in Washington will be good. Do I really expect that the Americans will contribute less to NATO if Britain doesn't stop prosecuting people for wrongthink? I doubt that, frankly. But certainly, if you look at the October issue of Quadrant and read, which I declare I'm the chairman of, and read John O'Sullivan's essay up the front, where he talks about the hundreds, if not thousands, of people in Britain who have recently been prosecuted by the police for having an online presence or having material in their possession which could potentially promote extremism. I mean, it is a great concern, particularly given that Britain historically has been the home of all these freedoms. So if the Trump impact is to cause people to rethink some of the politically correct excesses, some of the tendency to cancel culture and the new leftist green left censorship, which we saw in the wake of the pandemic, well, that's a good thing, obviously.
Maybe Trump will be their liberator.
Well, yes, and sometimes good things come from unexpected quarters.
And so just building on the international front, so obviously AUKUS is critical to Australia and the Western Alliance. Do you detect any changes there? I mean, the Biden administration was pretty locked in. Do you think Trump will in any way change that? I mean, I think he will expect at a minimum higher and better defence spending, as you've alluded to, from Australia, which is reasonable and we should do anyway. Beyond that, do you detect any challenges to that alliance?
Well, I think the first priority of a Trump administration in that area will be to boost America's defence industrial base, and all of our Western countries need to boost the defence industrial base. We need to boost our defence industrial base. I mean, we need to be able to produce munitions. We need to be able to produce missiles. I mean, we've been talking about missile manufacture in this country for at least 5 years now, and we still haven't gone beyond the press release phase. So all of us need to do more and better. America at the moment is not producing enough submarines for itself, and it must start producing more for itself before it can start to produce extra for us. But I do believe that there will be a substantial ramp up under this administration, and hopefully that means that the AUKUS agreement can realistically be delivered upon. But as we've said before, Dan, in these discussions, we need more subs now.
Yeah.
Not just in 10 years' time. Now, I mean, we have got to get these AUKUS submarines as quickly as we humanly can, but there's a whole lot of things that need to be done in the meantime. We've got to get our Collins-class subs back into service as quickly as possible so that more of them are available at any one time. I think we should be rotating our ships and planes through bases in southern Japan to send a strong signal to Beijing not to mess with the status quo across the Taiwan Straits. We've got to get our armed forces numbers back up to the existing inadequate establishment. There are currently something like 5,000 below establishment. We've got to get things like the Hawkeye light armoured vehicles actually certified into operational status. They haven't been for years. We've got these Tiger attack helicopters that have never been fully operational. So there are so many. We've got to get some drones, more armed drones. We've got to have missile systems, offensive and defensive. So there is so much that needs to be done in the military space. And again, I think that the Trump impact will be bracing and beneficial.
And then further on the international front, we've got China, Russia, Iran, North Korea as the key adversaries of the Western order. What's your assessment of how Trump will approach these issues, and how will that affect, particularly in the Middle East and also in the Ukraine? What's your assessment of how that might play out?
Well, I think Trump absolutely grasps, and this is, they say, one of the few things that is pretty much bipartisan these days in Washington. Trump absolutely grasps that America and communist China are in full-scale strategic competition. I mean, this is Cold War II. Let's hope it doesn't become a hot war, but certainly this is Cold War II. And you can't conduct yourself in the economic sphere in ways which damage you in the strategic sphere, particularly when you're in a situation of full-blown strategic competition. So I think Trump will continue with a substantial economic decoupling from China. I think he will raise tariffs very substantially against China. Now, I think it's easy for us to be over-alarmed about that. To be honest, while I don't say we shouldn't sell things to China, or indeed buy things from China, I do think we have to cut China out of all of our critical supply chains.
Yep.
Because as we have seen, more so than just about any other country, Beijing can turn trade on and off like a tap. Beijing sees trade as politics by other means, as strategy by other means, and we have to appreciate that. What for us is business, for them is politics and geopolitics. So we do have to cut China out of our vital supply chains. We do need to render ourselves much less vulnerable to China, at least while we've got the commissars in charge in Beijing. But as well as raising tariffs against China, Trump also is proposing substantial deregulation of America's domestic economy. Let's suppose there is a bit of re-regulation of the global economy or the external economy. If that's coupled with substantial deregulation of the domestic economy, I think overall economic activity will be increased, and I think that will be good for the world overall, even if it causes some difficulties vis-a-vis the Western China.
And that also would apply, I think, to the so-called green economy, because net zero is basically...
more taxes, more regulation,
and
everything becomes more expensive.
And it's also causing global supply chains to be reorientated towards China, which is what they've been talking about for 30 or 40 years.
Well, this is the paradox. I mean, every time we open a new wind farm or solar farm, we increase our dependency upon China, because 90% of these things are sourced and built in China, and they've got to be replaced so much more often than coal and gas-fired and nuclear plants. So we are making ourselves not just economically weaker, but we're making ourselves more dependent upon China. Now, Trump is entirely clear-eyed about this in a way that Biden wasn't, and in a way, frankly, that Green left governments in Australia and in Britain haven't been. And again, hopefully, this is one of the areas where the Trump effect will be both bracing and beneficial.
And Middle East, what's your assessment of how that might play out with Trump? He seems to be keen to try and achieve some kind of peaceful outcome as far as that's possible. He certainly did attempt that in his first incarnation. What are your thoughts?
Well, to his credit, Trump is a reluctant deployer of military force, and military force has always got to be a last resort. And yet demands or expectations that are not backed up with military force in the end can easily just become bluster, ineffectual bluster. We saw that in the Obama period, where he declared a red line against the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. Chemical weapons were duly used by the Syrian regime, and there was not any response whatsoever from the United States. I think that this was, if you like, an important punctuation point in America's relative decline. The failure to enforce what was a declared red line, just like the scuttle from Kabul was another important punctuation point in people's perceptions of America's readiness to act robustly in defence of freedom and decency. So look, I think Trump will be stronger in his support of Israel, and I think that's a good thing.
Yep.
That's not to say everything the Israeli government does is right, but Israel is essentially on the side of the angels, and Iran is essentially the polar opposite, at least under the Ayatollahs. Nothing against the Iranian people, as Netanyahu made clear in a very important broadcast to the Iranian people a couple of weeks back, but the current Iranian regime is a thoroughly malign force. So I think Trump will be a beneficial impact on the Middle East. As for Ukraine, well, of course, this is a terrible war. It is an absolutely terrible war that has cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives already. We would all prefer to see the war end, but I don't want it to end, and I don't think anyone should want it to end, in a victory for aggression. My instinct is that Trump will not try to force the Ukrainians into what is effectively a surrender, because were he to do that, it would be the worst sellout since Munich. And I do not believe that Trump would want to start a second administration with a capitulation on the scale of Munich. Because let's not forget that it's not just Moscow that has a stake in what happens in Ukraine. It's Beijing and Tehran and Pyongyang that also have a stake in all of this. So weakness somewhere can so easily become weakness everywhere. I don't think that the Ukrainians should be entirely averse to trading territory for security, but it's got to be genuine security. And were this to happen, there would then have to be a sustained effort to rebuild Ukraine, preferably using the confiscated assets of Russia and the oligarchs. And real security is really only going to be provided by either NATO membership or, at the very least, a tripwire force of Western soldiers in Ukraine to ensure that Putin doesn't use any peace as a breathing space to prepare for his next act of aggression.
Just one last question I'll ask Tony. I don't often like to ask you about day-to-day political matters, but I think the most important diplomatic post is that of ambassador to the US. And look, I think Kevin Rudd's got to go. I think the Trump administration will see him coming from a mile off. I've got no doubt he'll be in the Oval Office with a MAGA hat on and he'll be the biggest Trump supporter you've ever seen. But I think he's got to go. And if he won't resign, Albanese has to get rid of him, and someone's got to be in there who at least is a bit more balanced and doesn't have a history of disparaging the incoming president. Interested in your thoughts, and also whether you're on the short list as a potential, because I think you'd make a fine ambassador. But just interested in your thoughts on that very important diplomatic post.
Well, the first point to make is that I don't think I'm nearly diplomatic enough to be an ambassador. That's the first point I'd make. The second point I'd make is that I think that it would be, unusual for our closest ally to start being prescriptive about who can and can't be our ambassador. Rudd has said some injudicious things about the incoming president, but a lot of people have. A lot of people, including a lot of people on my side of politics here in Australia, have said, I think, injudicious and ill-advised things about President Trump. I mean, I've always taken the view that the American president is the leader of the free world. In effect, he's our president as well as the American president. And we should be careful, very careful, about public criticism of an American president or indeed an American ex-president. We should be careful of that. Certainly, if we have to disagree, let's disagree on politics rather than on the personalities. So look, and I also should say that, and no one will be surprised to hear me say that whatever you think of Kevin Rudd, you couldn't say that the guy is not hyperactive, and I am confident that Kevin has been hyperactive on our behalf as he sees it in Washington. So look, I would be surprised if there is any pressure from the Americans to change our ambassador. I have no reason to think that Kevin is not doing a good job at present. And you're right, he will do whatever he humanly can to win over senior people in the incoming administration. And he's already done everything he humanly can to row back his previous ill-advised remarks about the incoming president.
Well, that was a very diplomatic answer. So
most unlike me.
All right, Tony. Well, we'll leave it there for today. So thank you very much for your time and your insights, and we'll chat again in a fortnight.
Good on you, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.